one thing you'll see, again, quite often with triathletes when they're trying to work on that high elbow catch is they think they're doing it, but what they're actually doing is just flexing at the wrist. So they're just purely relying on the hand to generate propulsion, which is you're really cheating yourself because that forearm can generate quite a bit.
That Triathlon Show 123. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and on today's episode I interview David Pease, who is the National Lead of Sports Biomechanics at the Australian Institute of Sport, and swimming biomechanics is his specialty. He is a former swimmer himself and works with a lot of swimmers, both professional and amateur, and he has done a great amount of research on swimming biomechanics, so he knows both the practical aspects and the scientific and research aspects of swimming biomechanics inside and out. He's also the author of the Swimming Biomechanics chapter in the book Triathlon Science. As I've said before, the authors contributing to this book, Triathlon Science, are the best of the best at what they do, so I try to get all of them on the podcast, and there aren't that many more to go before I've covered that. Anyway, Dave got his bachelor's and master's in exercise science at the University of Southern California and the University of Colorado, respectively. Then he moved to New Zealand to do his PhD there. And now he lives in Australia and is coming up on living abroad as long as having lived in the US. Before the interview with Dave, let's thank our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration. They make electrolyte products for optimal performance and no more cramps. I got a great, really cool email recently from a listener who wrote in saying that he was sitting in an accommodation container somewhere in Kabul on a short mission with the UN Environment Team, listening to that triathlon show. I have a couple of tubes with me here, not only for the known purpose, but they're great for staying in good hydrated shape when acclimatizing to the heat and climate here. I use the 1500 version of Precision Hydration. And this is awesome. This is really cleverly done by this listener because obviously hydration is super important, vital, whether it's in a sporting sense or not. And remember that as a That Triathlon Show listener, you can get your first product of Precision Hydration electrolytes for free on precisionhydration.com using the code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. This episode is also sponsored by Ventum. The new Ventum C Mechanical is Ventum making superbikes available for the masses at a price point that is affordable for anybody who is looking to buy a triathlon bike. It uses the same patented frame design as their flagship model, the Ventum 1, which has no down tube and no seat stays to make it super aerodynamic, plus an integrated 1.4 liter water bottle in the top tube. But with the Ventum C Mechanical, you can get all this for a lot cheaper. They offer it in 3 options, 2 complete bike options and 1 frame set option. And the complete bike with Vision Team 30 wheels and mechanical gearing is $3,500 and for just a frame set it's $2,850. So check it out on ventumracing.com, and if you're looking for a triathlon bike that is fast but is affordable for most triathlon budgets, then look no further than the Ventum C Mechanical. Now let's hear the interview with Dave Pease. So I'm here today with Dave Pease to talk about swimming biomechanics. So Dave, how are you doing today?
Great, Michael. How are you?
Great as well. Catching a bit of a cold, but I'll let you do most of the talking to try to make the listeners not have to suffer through my nose stuffing up on me. Let's start, get right into the topic, and there are a few key overarching concepts in swimming biomechanics that I think that we should cover first, and also discuss how they relate to swimming in practice, something that the listeners can understand. So first, what can you tell us about the center of mass and how that's important in swimming?
Yeah, well, center of mass, which the easiest way to think about it is it's a single point in your body that allows you to represent the entire mass of the body in one place. So for most people, when you're just standing with your arms down at your sides, that's kind of right around your belly button or your navel, but that does move around a bit. So if you raise your arms up above your head, that center of mass will move up. And especially when we start looking at swimming, that works in combination with another point that we call the center of buoyancy. So depending how those 2 points align dictates how you balance yourself in the water. So what the center of buoyancy is essentially the center. If you took all the bits of your body that were actually under the water surface, so if you ride really high in the water, then you don't count the bit that's out, just the bits that's under. You find the one point that's kind of the center of that underwater mass. And what will happen is if your center of mass is closer to your feet than the center of buoyancy, then your feet are going to sink. And conversely, if your center of mass is closer to your head than the center of buoyancy, then your head's going to come down and your legs will rise higher. So that is all around maintaining your balance in the water. So that's where we look at body position or, the influence of wetsuits and things like that.
And we'll get into that in the troubleshooting part a bit later, but where is the center of buoyancy and the center of mass in a good swimming position with no sinking legs?
Yeah, they'd be pretty much right aligned. So if you had a picture of a swimmer in front of you, you'd have the center of mass and center of buoyancy would be just about one on top of the other, so that there's no torque or turning action caused by the center of mass around the buoyancy.
And where on the body would that be, roughly?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, if your arms are down by your side, it's going to be right around your belly button. So you figure in swimming, where you're most of the time going to probably have one arm above your head, it's going to be slightly higher than that, a few centimeters higher.
Okay, so
closer to the head.
Good. Next, let's discuss propulsion and how that is important in biomechanics.
Yep. Well, propulsion is obviously that's the force that we're looking for to move you forward through the water. So it's really in combination with drag, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, is really the whole key thing that we're looking at generating to maximize your performance. So that's where a lot of the technique issues that we'll talk about are really, especially when you look at freestyle, like we use in triathlon, are really focused on maximizing the amount of propulsion that we generate so that we can, get through the race as fast as possible.
And you generate propulsion with both your arm stroke and your kick. Obviously, roughly what is the percentage in freestyle swimming of the two?
Yeah, the percentage contribution is a little bit of a perpetual debate. That's one of our big problems in swimming is it's actually really difficult to quantify directly what the propulsive forces are. But you're probably looking for, especially when you start looking at a triathlete population, you're probably, I would guess, probably 80, 90% of your propulsion is going to be coming from your upper body. So that's not only your hands, that's obviously the big one, but you also are going to, if you use certain technique characteristics, you can actually start using more of your forearm as well, and even in some instances, a little bit of your upper arm. Whereas with the kick, you can, depending on how flexible your ankles are, that's a real big criteria that we need to look at. You don't tend to generate as much propulsion. Some people, you get the Ian Thorpes of the world who have really large feet and really flexible ankles, so the feet are actually almost closer to a fin. They can generate quite a lot of force, but that's really pretty rare in a triathlon population, especially with ankle flexibility is not normally a huge characteristic. So we do tend to focus more on maximizing that amount of propulsion that we can get, whether it's just from the hands or a forearm or whatever.
And when you measure propulsion in studies, or you simulate it in simulation work, do you use power like watts that triathletes would be used to in from a cycling sense to quantify the propulsion?
Yeah, you can. I think we tend to probably do it more just in pure force. So it could, because the forces are actually really quite low. You're talking, like an elite swimmer, like sprinter, would probably only be generating, I don't know, about 10 to 12 kilograms of force max. So we're actually not talking about huge loads here. So we tend to kind of look at it more in that. We can look at it in power. We'll do it more in that sense if we're doing more of a complete biomechanical analysis and we're wanting to look at joint powers. So what are the forces actually going through each of the individual joints in combination with the velocities? But yeah, yes, it is used, but it's probably not quite as common as just the simple force.
So I guess that the fact that you see even in elite swimmers low forces, that then we can deduce that it's drag that is something that you can use to distinguish yourself and become a better swimmer, because most people, it's not a lack of force that they have available to them that is limiting their swim, but the ability to use it and then how much drag they have. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think, and what I tend to kind of look at is that's very true, but it's almost, there is a bit of a continuum there. And what you tend to see is that the higher level athletes, swimmers, I should say, probably, are generally, they've got pretty solid technique already. So the propulsive forces are there already. So a lot of the little tweaks that they'll look at doing are more around the drag reduction. The less skilled you move down towards the bottom of the spectrum, you'll get people who are not very efficient movers in the water. So they may have really bad body position, all kinds of things, poor arm pull technique. So we'll actually spend more time with them on getting that proper technique to get the propulsion. And then once they've attained that, then we can start look at, okay, how can we now play around with, primarily it's going to be characteristics of body position. So how they sit in the water, what kind of materials their suits and things are made out of to try to get that drag force down. Because the bigger the difference we can have, the propulsive force, we want that as much greater than the drag force as possible, because it's that difference that really is going to dictate how fast you're going to go in the end.
That's an interesting approach. I think that you'll often see that people talk about trying to get their position right first, and then working on their stroke after that. But it's interesting to hear that you do it the other way, and I guess that you see good results with it, and that's why you do it.
Yeah, that's right. I think when you get really seriously bad body positions, then that's obviously got to be a real starting point. But yeah, so as I say, it does end up being a little bit of a continuum.
Yeah. Okay. And let's talk about momentum finally briefly as one of the key aspects here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the key things in swimming is that because of the nature of the stroke, if you actually track your velocity through the water, and if in biomechanics we would normally look at what's the velocity of the center of mass. So you can pretty much imagine that as what's the velocity of your hip. That's in general for freestyle swimming is pretty much close enough. And what happens is, because the stroke is quite cyclical with both arms, you get a lot of fluctuation in that velocity as they go through the stroke. And so what momentum is the mass of the swimmer times the velocity that they're traveling at. So we know mass is constant. So the changes in momentum that we see are all due to that velocity. And that becomes really inefficient if that velocity change keeps going up and down dramatically, you want to try to keep it as even as possible. So that's where you see how all the forces are being generated. You want them from the beginning of the stroke to the end as much as possible. That's where you'll see people who have some of the common technique flaws may only get a propulsive force just right in the middle of the pull. So in that situation, they've got a lot bigger time where their velocity is going to be slowing down, and then they've got to accelerate to get their average speed back up again. So we really want to try to keep that momentum as even as possible and just everything nice and smooth, just to make the effort go as long as we can.
Got it. Yeah. So that's like you can imagine like driving a car and trying to be fuel efficient. It's the same. You want it to be a constant speed and not accelerating and decelerating. So
precisely.
Yeah. And finally, before talking about the actual technique aspects of this, drag obviously interacts with these biomechanical things that we've been talking about. So how is drag generated in swimming, and how does it work really?
Yep. Well, the drag, so basically what we're looking at is any force that stops you from moving forward or tries to stop you from moving forward. So what we tend to see in swimming, there's a whole bunch, if you go into the real physics of it, there's a bunch of different types of drag. But when we look at swimming from a practical point of view, we really are only looking at 3 types. So you've got one, which we call friction drag. So that's just the simple resistance of water rubbing up against your body or the suit or whatever. And that just causes a bit of friction. So that tends to slow you down. Then we've got what's called form drag, which the easiest way to think of that is if you have somebody, if you're in the water looking head on at somebody swimming towards you and you took a photo of them, so from dead straight ahead, and then kind of drew an outline around every bit of their body that you can see. And then you work out, okay, what's the area of that in that picture, and then how fast are they going, and you can work out what the amount of drag is, the amount of form drag. So it's just that head-on frontal resistance that you get from the water.
Yeah, it's like the frontal area that listeners will be familiar with from cycling.
Correct. Yeah, from cycling. Yeah, exactly. You want to try to get that frontal area down as small as you can. And then we've got what's called wave drag. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but essentially what it is when you generate a wave in the water, that actually comes from you lifting a mass of water up, and then it falls down and then just sets up that familiar wave pattern. And the reason that's considered a drag force is that you actually have to use energy from your movements to lift that water. So that's energy then that you cannot use to generate propulsion. So you dissipate that off into generating a wave. So that's why it's considered to be a drag. And that actually can be at least as much as that frontal area, the form drag. And in some cases, we've seen like almost up to about 60% of the total drag can come from waves. So that's where you want to be nice and clean in the water, not, smacking your arms up and down, porpoising, those kinds of motions that you can sometimes see in less efficient swimmers.
And for the form drag, do you advocate a large-ish body rotation to minimize the frontal area, or how can we work on minimizing the form drag?
The biggest thing is going to be how high you can keep your legs and hips, so that you can keep that, like the frontal area, even when you rotate. I like a bit of rotation, probably about 30 to 40 degrees of rotation to each side. So a reasonable amount. And one of the reasons for that is that you actually put the arm into a stronger position when you're pulling. That's a big thing. And then it also gives a better sculling motion through the finish of the stroke and allows a better exit of the hand through the back of the stroke. So it's not going to change form drag a great deal. having that extra bit of roll, you do get, the opposite shoulder up out of the water. So you'll get a slight reduction. But it's a pretty fine line. I think the mechanical advantages that you get from getting that rotation, I think, outweigh any possible very slight reduction in form drag that you may see.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I was unconsciously already assuming with a constant body position, but of course you're right that that's where the big change can come from, and that's something that we will get into in the technique troubleshooting. So, but let's start with the actual stroke before going into that. Okay. And you mentioned a few things already, but what do you think a good stroke should look like for swimmers and triathletes, or is there a difference between swimmers and triathletes?
Yeah, I think there is actually. There's a few things. Probably the biggest, most common thing that you see is that in general, swimmers do tend to be a lot more flexible, especially in the shoulders. So when you start looking at a lot of the swimming, coaching tips and things like that, you get into starting to talk about issues like they'll call it, early vertical forearm or, real high elbow catches and things like that. And those are important, but they're also actually quite difficult positions to get into and use them effectively. So when you start looking at a triathlon population where that flexibility really isn't there, you can see people actually trying to do these quite elite swimming motions that they're really just not built for. So we really try to modulate that a bit. So what I tend to want to see is that with a triathlete, so the easiest way to picture it is if you have your arm, kind of imagine it's entered the water and you're stretching out in front and you're just about to catch the water. If you draw a line from the wrist to the shoulder, I'd want to see your elbow just above that line. And what we often will see with a triathlete is that elbow ends up being below the line. And so if you kind of do that holding your arm out in space and you drop your elbow and then start to kind of move your arm like you're going to do a swimming stroke, you'll see the hand tends to push down on the water. So that's actually not doing anything in terms of propulsion. If anything, it's, raising the front of your body, which ends up, creating more wave drag, as well as increasing the frontal area. So your form drag is going to go up as well. And then you're not going to actually get into a propulsive part of the stroke until further back in towards the middle. Whereas if you can keep that elbow above that line, that imaginary line, you'll see that the hand tends to want to start to pull backwards on the water a bit more. So that's really what we're looking for. It's very rare that I would see a triathlete that can get into a really enormous, really big high elbow where the elbow's significantly above that line, which we do see in more of the elite swimmers. So I think that's probably the big one between the two. And then also looking at the use of the kick. I don't know if you want to do that now, or we can talk about that a little bit later.
We can keep talking about the stroke now. So now that we know that we need to keep that elbow higher than the line between the shoulder and the wrist to get into a propulsive phase early enough, even if it's not a big vertical forearm. What are the other things that are important in terms of the stroke itself?
Yeah, the other thing I'd like to look for is that you do have, what's termed an S pattern pull. And the trick with that is that's also another very common coaching tip that you need to, your hand enters and you pull out a little bit and then you come back in towards the midline of your body and then back out again. And that is true. But what you can often see, especially in athletes that don't have a lot of body roll, they'll tend to exaggerate that. So they'll get that S curve is really big. So there ends up being a lot of lateral movement, which can make you snake around in the water, which is obviously not the most effective way to swim. So that's where some of the body roll stuff we were talking about before can actually come into play. So if you do have a good amount of body roll, what you'll tend to find is that if you almost intend to pull pretty much straight back, when you have that body roll, that will just naturally create that S-shaped pattern, and in a not too exaggerated fashion. So it'll be much more controlled. So if you look at it, from the swimmer's point of view or the triathlete's point of view, they would perceive the pull to actually look pretty straight. But if you looked at it from the outside, you'd actually see that there is more of that S-shaped pattern to it. And that's got some advantages in terms of getting clean water under the hand. So it makes the mechanics of the pull a little bit more effective. The other thing that we want to look for is the symmetry of the stroke. And that's another real big common problem, not only in triathletes, but in competitive swimmers as well, where you want to have the sweep of the stroke on both sides should be basically the same. So what I mean by that is that the out sweep at the front of the catch is going to be just outside of the shoulder. The maximum part of the in sweep will be hitting right kind of down the midline, center midline of the body, and then the out sweep back past the hip. The issue that we'll see, especially with triathletes, because they're in general swimming in open water with limited visual references, if you have an imbalance in those movement patterns, what you'll often end up seeing is that people will start to drift off to one side or the other. So you may have an athlete who, continually goes left in every course that they swim. So they have to end up spending a lot more time doing navigation or relying more heavily on other athletes to kind of keep them in line. And then you end up obviously wasting a whole lot of energy if you're doing that, because you're not, things aren't moving straight. So you're having to do all these corrections. So if we can keep that symmetry in the stroke, and so it doesn't have to be necessarily, that perfect S shape that I just was talking about, although that's the ideal we'd be looking for. Sometimes for, various flexibility or whatever reasons, that's really just not possible. So fundamentally, we want it kind of right around those positions, but that balance between the two sides is really the most critical thing.
Interesting. And as you say, that's I don't know if it's right or wrong, but what I tend to do is I almost never talk about the S-pull, but I just talk about, as you say, perceiving the stroke to go back towards the feet, but then assuming that you have that body roll adequately, then you will form that S-pull when you look at it from the perspective of the water, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the last part of the stroke? Do you advocate finishing completely? I think that's probably what most do, but I know of some coaches that advocate an earlier exit.
Yeah, because I think you want to be able to. Because the ideal pattern of the pull is that once you start that pull backward, you should be accelerating the hand all the way past to the finish of the stroke. So where I normally would say the stroke finishes is if you're wearing just a normal pair of Speedos, that your thumb would hit kind of just below that hip cutout, the hole at the top of the leg. So it just kind of brushes at the top of the thigh. I think what ends up happening is that sometimes what can happen is if you decide you're going to finish the stroke early, because there's a big change in direction that has to happen, in order for that change of direction to occur, you actually have to slow the arm down. So what a lot of people will do when they are trying to pull out too early is they actually decrease the amount of force that they can actually generate, because they're having to slow the hand down to get that change in direction. So you're always going to have it. There's no way to get around it, because the arm's got to get back through the recovery. But if you can carry on that acceleration and press through, you don't want to go, until your elbow's dead straight, because then you got nowhere to go and your arm's going to stop, hand's going to stop anyhow. But if you kind of finish an exit just before your arm hits that full extension, that tends to be the ideal.
Do you have any tips for swimmers who probably, a lot of athletes probably aren't aware of this acceleration and accelerating through the stroke? Is that something that you should consciously think about, or do you train it somehow? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it is. It is something you do have to think about a bit until you get used to how it feels. Because if you're used to just kind of um, kind of a constant speed of the hand through the pull motion, it will feel quite different. So you really do need to get that going, because the whole thing, one of the main reasons it's important is that if you have a constant speed, it's like if you're pushing against a big box on the ground. You can exert a lot of force when it's not moving, but once it starts to move, you can't actually get as much force against it. So the only way you can get that same force back is to start pushing harder and moving it faster. So it's the same basic concept here, that once you actually started the catch, in order to maintain that force under the hand, you've actually got to speed it up, because the water, you've already started to get moving. So you just can't, if you keep the movement at the same speed, you're not going to get as much force out of it. So you do need to work on getting that acceleration all the way through.
All right, so now let's talk about kicking just briefly, as you mentioned earlier. What's your take on that for triathletes?
Yep. Most triathletes are crap at it. Fundamentally, that's a bit of an issue. And I think a lot of that has to do, as I mentioned early on, with the level of ankle flexibility that they have. And that is really common. You get people that are coming out of running backgrounds or cycling backgrounds in particular, where they actually don't tend to ever get into those really big toe extension kind of positions, tend to be a lot more fixed. So they just have never developed that ankle flexibility that allows you to actually push back on the water with the top of the foot, which is really what we're trying to achieve. The way they tend to try to get that is that they'll do really excessive knee bend. And that's just quite inefficient as well, because you're, again, increasing drag. You get actually quite a small period of time where you're actually getting propulsion. And the other advantage that you have of if you keep the legs long and get your propulsion through having that good ankle flexibility, you also get that a bit of lift force as well as propulsion, which will help keep the legs up. What you do see with, and it's quite common, you see it relatively often with triathletes who don't have that flexibility, is if they say they are keeping their legs nice and long and straight, but they can't point their toes really, you'll actually see people kicking and moving backwards, which is obviously not all that beneficial. So for that reason, we play around a little bit with the triathletes. One of the big problems is that ankle flexibility is actually one of the harder joints to get flexible. So in some ways, you're almost stuck with what you've got. So in that situation, we'll tend to get athletes that don't have good ankle flexibility to try to minimize the kick and just focus on getting the legs up. So using what force they can generate just to keep the legs up so that they can keep in a more streamlined position.
Yeah. And I guess that is not all that bad, especially if it's a wetsuit swim, then you get that buoyancy to get your legs up. And especially for long distance triathlon, saving your legs a little bit is not a bad thing when you only lose potentially a small amount of propulsive contribution from the legs.
Exactly. But I think you will get into situations where people think that, I've really got to kick hard here. But if they don't have that ankle flexibility, they're really just going to blow themselves up because they're not going to get anything really that beneficial out of it. So they've got to learn to not get sucked into that trap and just use the kick for what it can be used for, as keeping the legs up. It also does provide some balance, and it's a counterbalance to the arms. Same kind of thing that you find in running, as a leg drives forward before heel plant, the opposite arm is driving forward to kind of counteract that torque around the long axis of the body. You get exactly the same thing in swimming, where the hand, as one hand enters and starts to catch, you're going to see that opposite leg kicking down at that same point. So you get that counteracting forces that help keep you nice and strong and streamlined through the core of your body.
And what about stroke rate, if we talk about that next? And
Yep.
is there a difference between stroke rate in the pool and in the open water?
There tends to be a little bit. You'll tend to see in open water, the stroke rates do kind of come up a little bit. And a lot of that is due to the increased demands of dealing with swells or tides and having to navigate a bit more. And you just need, with that higher rate, you're a bit more flexible in making those adjustments. In the pool, we'll tend to keep, things a bit longer because it's a much more controlled environment. So we can keep the rates down a bit and really focus more on the length. Whereas in the open water, that's not, sometimes you can get away with that. And again, it's going to depend on what the characteristics of your particular stroke are. But in general, I would say that, stroke rates are going to tend to start to rise a bit once you get into open water, especially in any kind of chop.
And do you advise triathletes and swimmers to aim for a particular stroke rate and work up or down to have an quote unquote ideal stroke rate for them, or how does that work?
Yeah, it really is. It is kind of an optimization process. So ideally, you want to try to get as much stroke length out of your stroke as you can. So you want to travel as far as possible for every stroke that you take, but that's kind of comes with a cost to some extent. It's the same kind of thing as if you're pushing a really massive gear on your bike. You can generate a lot of force, you can get a lot of speed going, but the rate's pretty low. Or you can do that with a smaller gear and have a higher pedaling frequency and get the same velocity, and you actually don't use up quite as much energy. So it is kind of finding that balance point for your physiology, your technique, where that rate that you're using gives you kind of an optimized length. So it's not going to give you the longest length that you can possibly generate, but it's going to find that point where there's a good balance between the two.
And how does that work in practice for an athlete if they want to find that point? Is it really a case of having a coach standing on deck and looking at them and saying, now you're at the sweet spot of stroke length and stroke rate, or is there any other way, any protocols that you use or recommend?
Yeah, you can do it by doing stroke counts at different paces in the pool. So you can play around, and especially if you start combining that, if you have a heart rate measurement as well, then you can start looking at what's that physiological cost. So you can do, say, a 40-second 50-meter swim, and you're going to take 30 strokes, and you've got a 120 heart rate or something. And if you go a 40-second swim, but you use 20 strokes, but all of a sudden your heart rate's jumped up to 160 because you're having to work a lot harder through each of those pulls. And so you just kind of you play around with different settings and see what actually suits. And so as soon as you start to see, what you'll tend to see is there'll be a point that you'll hit where you'll get a big drop off or a big spike in heart rate. So you'll get to a point where that rate and stroke count, you can't do it anymore, and you get really tired. So finding those kind of break points is probably the easiest way to do it. I probably made that sound a little bit harder than it really is, but fundamentally,
I know of a good article that we can link to in the show notes on the SwimSmooth website that describes this process. Okay. They don't use heart rate; they use RPE, but the principle is the same as you described.
The same. Yep, cool.
So let's talk briefly again about the most common problems that you see for triathletes in their technique and mechanics. I think we already mentioned that body position is one of them. So maybe we'll start there. And how can you correct that and work on improving it?
Yep. Well, for one, it is some of its head position. You can start with that. So if you tend to swim with your head too high, so ideally, like if you're in a pool environment where you've got nice references on the bottom and everything like that, you'd want the water level to kind of hit it just above your forehead, closer to the top of your head. obviously when you start swimming in open water and you've got to do navigation strokes and things like that, you're going to tend to lift the head a little bit higher so that you can just kind of do little peaks. But you don't want to be swimming as little as possible, at least, with your head much higher than with the water kind of just above your goggles. And the reason for that is you'll tend to drop the lower body down. So we try to limit that head position, and then also using the vertical force that you can get from your kick can also, and it doesn't have to be, you can do it with a 2-beat, standard, just kind of a cruising kick will provide enough of that lift if it's everything's kind of timed properly. So maintaining that body position is really going to be the biggest one. Once we go from the body position, then it's that high elbow, or the elbow above the line up on the catch. That's probably the second biggest one that we'll see. And that, a lot of that is some visualization kind of stuff that there's the old adages of once you've entered in the water, you imagine you're kind of reaching over the top of a barrel under your arm. That's a good visualization to have. Or, I used to have one that was you're trying to reach down a drain pipe, those kinds of things, just to help kind of get you into that position as much as you can. There are some training aids that you can use that will help with that a little bit. There's one from Finis. I just can't remember the name of it. It looks like a figure 8.
It's something like the fulcrum forearm something.
Fulcrum, forearm fulcrum. That's it. And what that'll do is it actually, because I should have probably said this too, one thing you'll see, again, quite often with triathletes when they're trying to work on that high elbow catch is they think they're doing it, but what they're actually doing is just flexing at the wrist. So they're just purely relying on the hand to generate propulsion, which is you're really cheating yourself because that forearm can generate quite a bit. But what that fulcrum will do, or something similar, is it just keeps that wrist straight and kind of forces you to keep that elbow nice and high up at the catch.
Yeah, I like swimming with tennis balls for that, for testing how well you use your forearms as well, holding tennis balls in your hands.
Precisely. Yeah, swimming with fists or tennis balls, or you can do there's all kinds of variations you can do with those. And even swimming a bit of dog paddle is another kind of a good one as well.
So, and generally speaking, are you a fan of training technique by swimming and doing these sorts of visualizations, or do you propose doing a lot of drill work? Where do you stand on that spectrum?
I think drill work is really important. It can be a little bit of a trap because people will start to do drills and then, there's a bit of it that a very small portion that may relate to what they're actually doing when they swim. So I wouldn't do a massive amount of drills because you can also get into some pretty bad habits. That's one thing, especially with paddles. That's a real common one. The first thing I'll tell any athlete is, like, most paddles come with a loop around the fingers and another one around the wrist. The first thing I'll tell any athlete is take the strap off of the wrist, never use it. Because that can introduce some really bad, you get some lazy habits because the paddle doesn't leave your hand if you do something wrong. If you take that wrist off, then it forces you to use a better propulsive technique. So it's really how you're going to use these things, and just make sure that the motions you're doing are going to resemble as much as possible the bit of the stroke that you're trying to work on. So if you're doing, say dog paddle or swimming with tennis balls or whatever, just remember that the focus of this is to try to get that elbow and focusing on using the forearm as much as you can, and really just make sure you're doing that, and try to keep everything else as normal as possible and not get into really goofy, big swingy motions that are going to develop into those bad habits.
Is there anything else except for the body position and working on that catch phase and having that elbow reasonably high that we need to talk about as the biggest mistakes. Obviously, we don't need to go into small things that make small differences. We want to keep it the big points.
Yeah, I think probably the other really big one that I do focus a lot on is that side-to-side imbalance thing. If you're going to be navigating a lot, you're going to be adding a lot of extra distance onto your swim, which is just going to kill you. So a good little test for that I often will almost do first thing is I'll get athletes to get into the pool, push off, take a few strokes, and then close their eyes and keep swimming. And because then once they close their eyes, they lose all those visual references, you'll get their natural behavior of the stroke. So you'll see, and it's very common for athletes to go 2 strokes and they'll hang an arm over a lane line. And that's a really good, quick and dirty way to work out, or to at least narrow down your focus on what you need to be looking at. And most often what it'll be, so if you tend to have an athlete who veers off to the right, once you kind of go back and look at what they're doing in the water, you'll see that the left arm tends to pull really wide. There's there are exceptions to that. There's other stuff that can happen, but the great majority of the time, that's going to be the situation. So it really can help you focus down and see where in the stroke that side-to-side motion is happening. And it could actually be during breathing as well. So that's another big thing to watch for, is that they may be fine when they're not breathing, but as soon as they turn their head, then that pulling arm will slide way out and make this big turning motion onto their swim.
Good. Yeah, that's a really good tip, and something that anybody who has a swim workout today, maybe you try that during warm-up, see how you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It gets entertaining for people watching too.
Yeah, so totally. One final question. It's a bit related to this, but I'm curious if you're aware of and what your opinion is on things like there is this device called the TrainSense Smart Pedal, and I'm sure there may be other ones that measure the stroke trajectory and power, and it's like a thing that you just strap on your finger basically. And have you used it? Do you know of it? What do you think about it?
I know of it. Yeah, I have. I haven't actually used one, so I can't really speak too much on how effective they really are. That area of technology has been just going absolutely crazy lately, using those inertial sensors and things to get the orientation of the hand. That I suppose that kind of raises one issue in that getting orientation of the hand from those sensors can be a little bit touchy. So I think that would probably be my only question is I'd want to have a bit of a play with them to see how well they actually do replicate the hand paths. The stuff I've seen, I've looked on their website in the past. I came across them, several months ago, I think at least, the middle of last year probably. And it does look really interesting. It's a big improvement. There's been some similar systems that just kind of look at pressure under the hand. And I've never really liked those because you can't tell what direction the pressure's being applied. So you could have an athlete with horrendous technique, but it looks like if you just look at those pressure curves, like they're doing fine. But, all of that force could be just going vertically and not moving them forward through the water. So having that orientation is a really big bonus without having to do it, through the old-fashioned manual digitizing and things like that you'd have to do traditionally to get that kind of information.
Yeah, I actually used it once on a coaching course on myself. I was a guinea pig for it, so I got a report with those trajectories. It was really interesting, but I'd need to do use it with more purpose to really have a big opinion on it. But with the work that you do and the research, I was curious to hear what you thought about it.
Yeah, we used to, in the time back in, this goes back far too longer than I'd care to mention, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was working with U.S. Swimming, we did that kind of stuff all the time. But it wasn't with an actual sensor. We'd collect a lot of 3-dimensional video and then do calculations on the positions of the hand that we determined on the computer. So that kind of information can be hugely useful. You can get a really good idea of how effective athletes are being. But yeah, as I say, I just want to have a bit of a play with one and compare it against some other measures just to see how reliable and accurate it really is.
Yeah. All right, let's finish up with the rapid fire questions, and in just one sentence or less, answer these. The first one being, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon or swimming?
I'm probably pretty old school on this, so I'm going to say my favorite book would be The Science of Swimming by James Councilman.
What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
As a swimmer, when I was swimming, I would have said probably my kickboard.
And what do you wish you had known or wish you had done differently at some point in your career?
In my swimming career, I wish I knew as much about technique as I do now, because I would have probably saved myself a lot of pain in my shoulders. And professionally, I should have finished my PhD a lot faster than I did.
So that's about it for today's interview. Thank you so much, Dave. It was really great having you on, and really interesting perspective from somebody who really knows the ins and outs from both the practical and the research side of things of swimming mechanics. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview with Dave. My key takeaways from the interview were first that the key things to focus on, and this is nothing new really, but it's good to repeat it and reinforce it, working on body position and keeping the elbow up, not necessarily trying to have the world's greatest early vertical forearm, because that's, as Dave said, probably not possible with our mobility, but making sure that it doesn't drop below your hand, that is between your hand and your shoulder, as we talked about, and also making sure that your stroke is symmetric. So the ways that you would work on this, as Dave talked about, was for body position, focus on head positioning and maybe trying to drop it a bit in the water if you hold it too high, and to some extent work on using your kick to keep the legs up. For the symmetry side, try to swim with your eyes closed and see what happens. Do you sway to one side or the other? Then maybe your stroke is too wide on one side and you need to make it more symmetrical that way. The second takeaway is that if there's nothing terribly wrong with your body position and balance in the water, then it might make sense to focus more on the actual propulsion side of thing than actually focusing on body position and improving that further. And that's something that goes against what you sometimes see, which is the reason that I bring it up here, that this might be something that you want to try if you have worked a lot on body position and you haven't seen results. Obviously, Dave has seen results with working on the propulsion, so definitely believe that there's a lot to this approach. So maybe give that a try if that's something that you think would work for you. And finally, remember to accelerate throughout your stroke. This is something that hasn't come up often either, and so that's why I bring it up here, because I think it's really important, but it's not one of the most common points made. I only remember it being talked about once, and that was in my interview with Rob Sleemaker from Vasa, CEO of the company making the Vasa trainer. I think it's worth pointing out here, as I said, to make sure that you have that acceleration from the beginning through the end of your stroke and not going at a single speed. As usual, you can find the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. If you have questions or comments, leave them on that show notes page and I'll answer right there. If you enjoy the podcast, it would really mean the world to me if you could rate and review it on iTunes. This helps it go up in the iTunes rankings, which ultimately helps keep the podcast coming out at this rate with sponsors, and also it helps get great guests to the show when they see that the podcast is a top-ranked triathlon show. So there's room to grow there, so please help out with that. Massive shout out to somebody who did post a review on iTunes, and that was Jordan in the United States. He writes in the Best Triathlon Show, 5 stars. This is a great podcast that is always full of good info. What I appreciate most about your podcast is that you have a lot of professional guest speakers on this show. And when you don't have these guests, you don't make statements without backing them up with evidence. In the few circumstances where you do put in personal opinions, you specifically state it. In other words, your podcast is not simply you talking about your own opinions and no research to back up your preferences in training. Thank you for taking time to interview the wide variety of guests you have. The questions you ask are thoughtful ones. Big thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate it. And as I said, if you want to help out a little bit, then you posting a rating and review really helps out a ton. So please do that if you have even just a minute or two to spare. That really helps. Thank you to Ventum for sponsoring this episode. You can check out all of their bikes on ventumracing.com, from the flagship Ventum 1 to the new Ventum C Mechanical. They are all designed to have radical aerodynamic designs without down tubes and seat stays. The water bottle is integrated to make it a speed machine. And if you haven't already, make sure that you go back to episode 115, where I interview Ventum co-founder Jimmy Sears on bike maintenance in general. Whether you have a Ventum or not, this is worth listening to. And thank you to Precision Hydration. Remember that you can take their free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com. This will give you a personalized hydration strategy for your next race. And you can use the discount code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, to get your first box of Precision Hydration product for free. Check out their blog under the Hydration Advice tab as well, because they have a lot of information there that you can use, whether you use their products or not. This is helpful for anybody who is interested in performing well in training and racing. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.